We're getting closer to leaving it together. Finally got the carbon fiber frame rails cut for the chassis to replace the ABS ones. This design is considerably different in a number of ways. The drop down stays low throughout the back and then kicks back up. This here is at the same height, so you can see that the center section is much lower than the current frame rail, but you don't really need a high rail in this section. It doesn't really benefit you any, so lowering it down is going to give us some opportunity to mount some things, keep our interior nice and low. And then I also separated the shock towers, so shock towers will now bolt on separately in this back position here. That'll give me the ability to change them or flip them, do whatever I've got to do as needed. Now I haven't deburred this piece yet, but I'm going to get that done. Chassis swap is all done. Everything bolted in place. All the clearances are just like they should be in CAD. You can see I've got a little bit of room above the truss before the frame rail touches. It's very close, but that's at full bump. So no springs on the shocks. So the shocks are all the way down. That's as close as it gets, at least, and everything matched to exactly what the CAD model said it would, which is good news. Everything else is just sitting in there, basically the same as what it was before, but now in the carbon chassis, which is obviously super rigid. It's 3mm carbon, so it's, I mean, just rock solid. You can see there. Oh, one other thing that I didn't mention is that these frame rails are longer than my previous ones. These stay nice and low, then they go up. This height, anyway, was actually dictated by the position of that 3D engine that will sit just right back here and over top of the rear truss of that rear axle. So it'll all just kind of sit right back here, hugging these frame rails. The turbos will actually hang on the outside of the frame rails, and should be cool. Today I'm going to cut the carbon fiber steering plates that I need for the front bell crank setup. I'm just going to run you through how that gets accomplished. Now I've already written the tool paths for the plates, and they're already loaded here in the controller. Here is my plate of 3mm carbon. Now I've already put my woodworking tape on there, which is what I'm using for work holding. This is just a two-sided tape that comes in a roll like this. You put it on in place, and then you peel off this backing, and that's when you get the other side of the tape there. Once that's done, we can flip this over and get it into place, and it's actually not super crucial where on the table that this is, because we're only working in a pretty small working envelope, so we just make sure that it's put down in place. But the one thing that we need to do is tell the router, or teach the router, where the material is. So we're going to take and jog the tool head over to about where I want to cut. So I'm just using the arrow keys for that. So once I have the spindle about where I want my 0 point, which has been determined in the actual cam file that I made for the parts, then I'm good with that. I need to set the height from the bottom of the tool to the actual material, the offset. Now I have a tool offsetter. What I like to do is put my spindle about in the middle of the parts, and then set the offset at that point. Routers aren't super high precise, so I just try and get the best shot at all the parts by going to the center. So we'll raise this up. I'll put my tool offsetter under the spindle, and then we'll run the offset macro. And now it's set that height based on the top of the material, which is also a setting in the actual cam file. It knows the height exactly of the offsetter, so you just use it and touch off. For carbon fiber, I use these bits here, which are 3mm PCB cutting tools. They're just kind of like a burr wheel spin them at a pretty high RPM, and they leave a nice finish. Now that we've got the offset programmed in, we can put our dust collection on. Just goes on there magnetic, and we can run the program. And there we have our upper and lower plates. So those two carbon plates get sandwiched, or sandwich I should say, this 3D printed part. Now those carbon plates had a bearing pocket that was machined in the back side of each one. And then the rest of the bearing pocket exists in the 3D printed part. So there's a bearing on top and bottom that are separated by a couple of millimeters in the middle. They're 1 millimeter, I think. And that's going to be what our steering shaft is going to rotate on. This is 5 millimeter precision ground rod, and that is what will become the actual shaft for our bell crank. So what I'm going to do right now is experiment a little bit. I'm actually going to take and recreate a servo horn out of steel. I've got some steel plate. I'll do a very simple rudimentary one, and then probably just quickly TIG weld it to one end of this, just to make sure that, you know, maybe it will even exist in the long run. Or I'll have the this will just kind of be a temporary. I'll play around with some things, and I'll have proper ones laser cut. I don't know. We're just gonna experiment, try and make a little bit of progress while I kind of flesh out this design. Right, so I've got the 1/4 inch piece of plate steel cut, the size of a servo horn roughly, 24 millimeter. There's a hole that's marked on the end there that I need to drill and tap for the actual linkage still, but it's welded to that piece of 5 millimeter shaft that goes through, and I've also drilled a cross hole on that shaft. So for a mock-up, I've also drilled a servo horn and drilled a cross hole in it, so that will be able to go on, and I'll actually be able to pin those together to make this function. I'm not sure that this is the actual piece that I'll use. Definitely won't be the servo horn that I used. I just drilled it to an approximate size, and I'll want it much tighter if it was to be the way that I actually went. But I should be able to pin these together to make sure that everything is going to work and clear the way that I want in the actual metal piece. So a little bit closer. Back in the studio with the Class 911 here. Everything is progressing, things are moving forward, and I've accomplished some of those big hurdles that I had left hanging out there. The windshield frame is done in carbon fiber, and it has been cut out. You can see that we got the that done, and it doesn't leave much around it. And I was always conscious of that. I was, you know, concerned about it as much as I can be, and I just have to be, you know, I just have to know exactly what I've done here. Now, I did make sure and lay extra amounts of carbon in there to try and beef it up as much as I can. And I think it'll still be fairly strong, but, you know, again, have to be realistic. Now, this hasn't been wet sanded yet, so it's still that rough, straight out of the mold texture. So I've got to get that done still. And then, of course, it has to get bonded into the rest of this, which I'm kind of still leaving up in the air a little bit until I get like the cage and everything secured and done, so that I make sure that it all fits. I want it to fit well to the cage well to the frame. Just everything needs to work together and fit properly. Everything was done in CAD. Everything was fit to a jig. Everything should be perfect. So it needs to just go where it's supposed to be to make sure that it's all right. That's a step down the road. Hopefully I can get that done in the next week or so. Now, another huge step to all of this is that the chassis has been swapped. I cut the final version of the carbon fiber chassis. I would have loved to have left it in the computer and kept tweaking and adding this and that and whatnot, but I didn't have time, so I just needed to make a decision and get them cut. I did both my chassis and Matt's chassis, sent his to him, and he got it here at the end of last week. Now, on the back side of the chassis, you can kind of see here the rear skid plate slash, you know, engine mount. This will hold that flat 6 twin turbo engine, and then it also kind of supports it and covers it up in case anything from the backside were to come up and smack it. Just integrated in, tried to give it a little bit of style to make it look cool, but not completely hide it. So if you've got this car and you're looking underneath of it, you should be able to see some of the details that we decided to put into it. Speaking of that engine model, you saw it detailed in Matt's video. Also, I had finished up kind of the rear portion of it that wasn't shown in there, which is like a transmission and transaxle design, and that was mainly to allow me to mount it in there and kind of finish off the back side of that motor. I did host that motor up on my website, so if you'd like to download it, 3D print it yourself, go for it. There is a cost to downloading it. It's $6.99. There was a ton of hours in that thing, and I don't expect many people are going to want to use a twin turbo flat six in many builds, so it is what it is. Or if you just want to download it so you can 3D print it for your desk to remember our struggle of the Class 1 this year. There you go. I'll put a link to it in the description below. But speaking of designs being done, I finalized the design of the front bumper and rear bumper brackets, as well as the slider brackets, and the cage brackets. What I mean by all of that is the laser cut parts that are going to be bolted to the chassis and then integrate into either the tube sliders or the tube bumpers or the tube cage. That was another one of those hurdles like I spoke about that I just needed to get over. All of those parts were designed and then sent to Send Cut Send. Now I had mine done out of titanium to match my cage, and I'll TIG weld those all together. I also sent all those files to Matt so that he could have them done out of mild steel. Easy to braze with. Send Cut Send, super affordable for all that stuff. Even titanium, which is pretty exotic, even with some of the thickness that I went with, the costs are really, really reasonable. If you're interested in having your own files done at Send Cut Send, you can send them about any file type, from like photo type files, bitmap, Illustrator, if you're not familiar with CAD. Like if you can get it into a dimension somehow drawing, they can make it for you. It's super nice to do. Along with all of those titanium bits and bobs, I also drew up some servo horns that I had them laser cut out of 1/4" mild steel plate. And that is going to be for our front bell crank steering. You saw the prototype that I made earlier, and I'm pretty happy with that proof of concept, but I wanted to make it maybe just a little bit nicer, or at least have the ability to. So while I was sending files, I had those cut, and I had an array of them cut, maybe like 4 of each of the sizes, 8 pieces total. And I think the cost was like $8. It was super cheap. Now I do have a fully functioning bell crank steering system in this truck currently. Before I had the 3D printed one, now fully functioning, bearing supported on a proper 5mm shaft, and everything is in decent shape. On the top, I've got a modified Vanquish 24mm servo horn, and I've got it cross drilled and then bolted through with a 2mm screw, and then it all clamps down. The clamping force of the clamping servo horn, as well as a lock nut on the other side of that M2. Now I may go with a similar design when I do the actual laser cut steel ones. That may still be the route that I want to go with. But for now, this one actually works fine. And I could probably leave it and everything would it would be no problem. But the one thing with this is that the normal splined area is a little bit larger than the 5mm diameter. I drilled a 5mm hole through the top flange area, but that's not very thick. So it doesn't have a ton of support in that area. So it's got a little bit of a rock to it, kind of up and down. I don't know that it would affect my strength any. I think that most of the load on this point would be through that M2 screw, which is a grade 12.9, so at least it has some decent strength. I'm happy with the steering. Everything goes to full lock. I've got a lot more throw if I need it, and I likely will need some of it because I'll grind the steering stops off of these axles so that I can crank those wheels a little bit further. The whole front cross brace with the machined carbon fiber and the 3D printed parts in the middle all just work like I had hoped, like I had designed. Now, the one thing that I haven't done is tested them for longevity, but I don't have much concern there as the bearings are half supported in that carbon fiber. And I think that the strength of that is going to be more than enough, let alone the additional support of the 3D printed material. So I think that we're going to be in good shape, and I really don't have any concerns on this thing holding up. Pretty pleased with the overall design. Now I do have the Reefs 300IS comp spec winch back into place as well, and I've integrated this little fair lead area right here in through that cross member. So the line will just feed through there and then out through the bumper. That'll keep everything nice and lined up and where it's supposed to be. On the sliders here, I 3D printed a slightly modified version of the files that will, be a representation of the combination of tube and laser cut parts that will go together. I did that so that I could kind of work out the initial versions of the cage mount as well as the body mounting system that will inevitably be on here. Currently, I haven't really started on the body mounting, but what you're going to see is you're going to see, rather than these two like spacer pieces that you see here, there'll be a system in through there that will have a nice mating surface that will have a corresponding one on the inside of the body, and everything will screw in through the outside. I'll likely want to line the outside of the body with a material like an aluminum or possibly a titanium and get that bonded into place to act like a nice washer. That's all hopes and dreams at the moment, but I think that we can make it happen. I'm not overly concerned. And if I needed to, I could 3D print like a representation of the body in case I needed to like work the metal to make sure that it was going to sit reasonably flat before I put it onto the actual carbon fiber. That wouldn't take any time. Design time on that would be very quick. So not wasting a lot of resources by doing that. And by keeping that body mounting super simple with a couple of screws from the outside on each side, also keeps things simple, because that's about the point that we're getting to. Of course, there's still a lot of major things to accomplish. The interior design is another big step, but one that I feel like will be much more enjoyable and hopefully much simpler. What I've set myself up for throughout the design is to be able to give myself a nice big flat floor in throughout. That will be the base. It will attach cleanly and easily, I hope, and just give me that room to work and dress it up on the inside with parts that I hope I have time to make look appropriate to the inside of this vehicle. As part of that flat floor, I'll also make room for inner fender liners, things like that, to try and clean up the inside so you don't see through anything. I still need to integrate in things like a battery compartment, but that stuff should go reasonably quickly. Exterior design is still a big thing on the checklist. I need to do my final sand, get it down to the finish that I'm happy with before we shoot clear coat. I'll get a nice clear coat on this whole thing, something that just gives it some depth before we put on the final design that will go on at the end. Fabrication of the bumpers on this should be very simple. Those laser cut parts should really help dictate those things, and that should just get done. The rear still looks pretty empty without the tail light section that goes all the way across the back side of this. So you need to get that on, and then that bumper will sit just below it. A similar story for the front. We need to get that front bumper all the way across. And of course, we still need to get lights situated on the front of some sort as well. I hope to have something that is fairly representative of the bezel and lens that this car would actually have. By no means are we on the downhill side of this thing yet, but we're not far from that crest. Once the cage is solid mounted and the body sits properly where I think that it should, I'll feel very good, and I think we can just jam on details without having to worry about how the whole big picture is going to go together again. That's my hope for the next time you see this car. Cage, final mounted, bumpers, front and rear, done, body, finish sanded. At that time, hopefully I'm working on interior paint and details while also kind of bouncing around the car for some of the other, big things to check off the list still. I do also have my temporary rear wing sitting on there. This was a quick 3D print that I did with some mesh stamped in there to just kind of see what the final look is like. Still need to cut out the backside of that trunk so that we'll be able to see down and see our handiwork on that engine. I feel like a rear wing is still a must. You'll have to let me know what you think on that one. I know it's going to be prone to damage or even complete removal at times, but I feel like we have to have the ability to put that on there. So, I don't know. What are your thoughts? Also on the interior, I feel like we should still try and go with like the 2+2 design. Try and fit some sort of tiny rear seating in that thing. Helps with some scale points and, it's still scale. But that gives you a current status update as to where we sit on this. If you're enjoying this build, let us know. Matt and I have been going all out, and it's been a journey. Not easy, and a ton of work, a lot of stress, and the days are wearing. I think we're around like that 36-day mark now, which is ridiculously frightening. And if you have any suggestions for the livery to put on here, drop them now, because I've got to make a final decision on that as well. As always, hit the like button. Subscribe if you're not already. Hit the notification bell so you see the videos as soon as they get uploaded. One day, we'll be done.
Until then, thanks as always for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.